The auctioneer's chant was a hypnotic rhythm under the hot July sun of 1972, a staccato beat that separated men from their money. It rolled across the flattened grass of Dawson's farmstead, over the rows of sun-faded machinery, and the hopeful, anxious faces of the crowd gathered there like mourners at a funeral no one wanted to attend. The heat rose from the packed earth in visible waves, bending the horizon, turning the distant tree line into a shimmering mirage that looked like water, but was only air heated beyond what the eye could trust. Somewhere behind the machine, shed a meadowlark was singing the clear, bright notes, floating up and vanishing into a sky so blue and so enormous it seemed to belong to a different world than the one unfolding on the ground beneath it. The air smelled of cut grass and diesel fuel and the particular dusty sweetness of old machinery baking in the sun, a smell that anyone who has ever attended a farm auction would recognize instantly and never forget. Eli Hargrove stood near the back of the crowd, his arms crossed over his chest, the sweat already soaking through the collar of his chambray work shirt and darkening the fabric in a spreading half-moon across his back. He was 32 years old, lean and quiet, with a jaw that had been set in the same firm line since childhood, and hands that told the story of his life better than any autobiography ever could. Calloused palms worn smooth in the places where tools rested, most often the ridges of hardened skin following the same lines as the handles of the wrenches and the hammers and the fencing pliers he had used every day since he was old enough to hold them. Grease permanently settled into the creases of his knuckles. Dark lines that no amount of lava soap could fully erase, ingrained so deeply they had become part of his fingerprint. A mechanic's tattoo that could not be washed away because it had been earned one repair at a time over the course of 2 decades. A scar ran across the back of his left hand where a wrench had slipped on a frozen bolt 3 winters ago, the skin there pale and slightly raised, a small topographic map of one bad afternoon, and the lesson it taught about leverage and patience and the importance of warming a bolt with a propane torch before you tried to break it free. These were not the hands of a man who hired out his problems. These were not the hands of a man who picked up a telephone and called the dealer service department when something broke. These were the hands of a man who fixed things himself, who believed with a conviction that bordered on religious faith that the distance between a man and his machinery should be measured in inches, not in invoices. He was not here to buy big. He never was. He had come for a set of cultivators, old Formal H cultivators, that might fit his grandfather's tractor, something he could perhaps pick up for $20 or $30 if the bidding stayed lazy, and the serious buyers stayed focused on the bigger items up front, where the real money was being spent and the real reputations were being established. The real show, as it always was at these events, was centered on the men who had come not to buy bargains, but to be seen buying, to stake their claim on the social hierarchy of the farming community through the public demonstration of purchasing power. Wade Prescott held court like a king, surveying the boundaries of his expanding kingdom. He was not bidding on this small-time stuff. He was simply there to be seen, to occupy space with the particular authority of a man who believed that his physical presence in any location automatically elevated the importance of whatever was happening there. Leaning against the fender of his brand-new pickup truck, a gleaming Ford F-250 that still carried the dealer's paper plate in the back window and had not yet accumulated its first scratch or its first scuff or its first honest piece of mud, he wore a crisp, clean Western shirt with pearl snaps that caught the sunlight. When he shifted his weight, a new pair of boots with soles that had never touched anything softer than pavement, and a smile that never quite reached his eyes. The smile was a tool the same way the truck was a tool, and the boots were a tool deployed strategically to project the image of a man who had everything figured out and wanted you to know it. Wade was 35, big-shouldered and broad-chested, built like a man who had done physical labor in his youth, but who had recently discovered the pleasure of letting other men do it for him. His voice could carry across any room or any field or any auction yard without the slightest effort, a natural amplifier that he used the way a preacher uses a pulpit to command attention and shape opinion and remind everyone within earshot that he was the center of whatever story was currently being told. He had the kind of confidence that comes not from knowing you are right, but from needing everyone around you to believe it. And there is a difference between those two varieties of certainty, as wide and as deep and as dangerous as the Missouri River. Beside him, looking nervous and important all at once, stood Mr. Holloway from the Farmers Trust and Savings Bank. His tie was already loosened against the heat, the knot pulled down an inch from his collar, and his forehead glistened with a thin film of perspiration that he kept dabbing at with a folded handkerchief that had started the morning white and was now gray with the accumulated residue of dust and sweat. His shoes, polished that morning to a shine you could check your teeth in, were coated with a fine layer of farmyard grit that made them look like they belonged to a man who had wandered much farther from the sidewalk than he had intended or desired. The two of them stood together like co-conspirators at a scene they had helped create, but would never acknowledge responsibility for the banker and the borrower, the enabler and the enabled, two halves of an equation that only balanced as long as the prices kept climbing and the rain kept falling, and nobody asked too many questions about what would happen if either of those conditions changed. They were selling Dawson's life, piece by piece, lot by lot, item by item, each one called out by the auctioneer and assigned a price that had nothing to do with what it was worth to the man who had owned it and everything to do with what the market would bear on a hot afternoon in July. A good man, Dawson. Everybody said so, and everybody meant it. He worked hard every day of his adult life, kept his fences straight and his rows clean, raised three children who said yes, sir, and no, ma'am, and held doors open for their elders and understood that the world owed them nothing they had not earned with their own effort. He never missed a Sunday service, never turned down a neighbor who needed help, never said a harsh word about anyone in the county that he would not have said to their face. But he had overextended himself. One good harvest year, one season when the corn came in heavy and the price was strong and the future looked like a highway that only went in one direction, and he had let Holloway talk him into a new Gleaner combine that cost more than his entire farm had been worth 10 years earlier. The payments looked manageable on the projection sheet. The banker slid across his desk, the columns of numbers marching in neat formation toward a future of increasing prosperity that was guaranteed by nothing except optimism and the assumption that good years would continue indefinitely. And then two bad years came back to back, like punches from a fighter who would not let you off the ropes, and the payments that had seemed so reasonable in the warm light of a good season became chains around his ankles, dragging him toward a depth from which there was no swimming back to the surface. The bank had called his note. The legal process had engaged with the indifferent grinding efficiency of a machine designed to do one thing and do it thoroughly, and now Dawson's mistakes were spread across this flattened grass for the entire county to examine and evaluate and bid upon, picked over by his neighbors, with the guilty hunger of people who know they are participating in something unseemly but cannot bring themselves to walk away. $20 bid now, 25. Will you give me 25? The auctioneer's voice rattled across the crowd, a gravelly sing-song rhythm that rose and fell with the practiced cadence of a man who had been converting loss into revenue for 3 decades. His patter was almost musical, a dark and mercenary melody that transformed the dismantling of a family's legacy into a form of entertainment. And the crowd leaned into it the way audiences lean into any performance that is skillfully delivered, regardless of the subject matter. Sold for $25 to the man in the Pioneer seed corn cap. Eli watched Wade Prescott laugh at some comment from the banker. A big booming laugh that was manufactured to be heard from one end of the auction grounds to the other, a laugh that was less about humor and more about the establishment of territorial dominance, the way a rooster crows from the highest fence post. Not because he has something to say, but because he needs every other rooster in the yard to know exactly where the power resides. Wade was the future, or so the prevailing wisdom held. He farmed nearly 1,000 acres now, all of it leveraged to the last dollar of available credit, borrowed against and mortgaged and financed through instruments that had names and structures Eli did not recognize and did not care to learn. His fields were worked by the newest and biggest iron that International Harvester could manufacture and ship to an Iowa dealer's lot. His brand new 1066 tractor with the factory cab and air conditioning and a stereo radio that pulled in stations from 3 states was the subject of conversation at every coffee shop and co-op counter in the county. Men spoke about that tractor the way boys speak about a new bicycle, with undisguised reverence and barely concealed envy and the burning, aching desire to own one exactly like it. Wade had traded in a perfectly good 856 to get it a tractor that still had years of honest, productive service left in its bones and its bearings, in its hydraulic system, and he had done it not because the old machine had failed him, but because the new one existed, and because the banker had said yes, and because the world, in 1972, rewarded ambition and punished caution, and measured a man's worth not by what he owned outright, but by what he could persuade an institution to let him borrow. He told anyone who would listen that a man could not make money sitting on old junk. He usually said it loud enough for Eli to hear. He made sure of that. Eli's old junk was a 1968 John Deere 4020. He had bought it used 4 years earlier and paid cash for it, every single dollar, counted out on the kitchen table the night before the transaction, stacked in neat piles of tens and twenties, while his wife Margaret sat across from him and watched the money accumulate between them, with a look on her face that was equal parts pride and worry, her fingers laced together in her lap, her eyes moving between the stacks of bills and the face of the man she had married and the magnitude of what they were committing to. $4,000. It was not nothing. It was most of what they had saved in the 3 years since Eli's father had died and left them the farm and the responsibility of making it work. But the tractor was worth it. It was clean, well maintained by its previous owner, a retired farmer from 2 counties east, who had cared for it the way some men care for a horse they love, with attention and diligence, and a genuine regard for the machine's welfare. A side console synchro range transmission that shifted as smooth as butter on a warm skillet, each gear engaging with a precise, satisfying click that told you the synchronizers were tight and the detents were unworn, and everything inside that cast iron housing was exactly where the engineers at the Waterloo factory had intended it to be. It did not have a cab, just the flat-top fenders and a canopy Eli had fabricated himself from angle iron, and a piece of sheet metal bolted to the fender brackets with grade 8 hardware and sealed with a bead of silicone caulk to keep the worst of the rain from dripping down the back of his neck during those spring planting days, when the weather could not decide whether it wanted to cooperate or not. The diesel engine was honest. That was the word Eli used when he described it to Margaret, and it was the right word, the only word that captured what he meant. An honest engine. You could hear every beat of its heart, the deep rhythmic thump of the 6 cylinders firing in their ordained sequence, a sound as steady and as reassuring as a grandfather clock in a quiet hallway. You could feel the power thrumming up through the steel deck plate and into the soles of your boots, like a pulse, like a second heartbeat that synchronized with your own, until the boundary between man and machine became a matter of philosophy rather than physics. It started every single time. In the dead of January, when the wind chill dropped to 30 below, and the oil in the crankcase was thick as cold honey, and every exposed piece of metal burned the skin on contact. In the sweltering August heat, when the air above the hood shimmered like a desert mirage, and the steering wheel was too hot to grip with bare hands, every time, without exception, without excuse, without drama. And Eli knew every bolt and grease fitting on that tractor, the way a man knows the topography of his own palm, every contour memorized through the repetition of 10,000 inspections, every dimension cataloged in the library of his hands, where knowledge lived not as words or numbers, but as the physical memory of touch and tension and torque. His other tractor was his grandfather's 1948 Farmall H red paint, faded to the color of an old barn that has weathered 40 years of Iowa seasons, the original decals long since worn away to faint ghosts of letters that could only be read in certain lights at certain angles by someone who already knew what they said. But the little 4-cylinder engine, a flathead design that had been old-fashioned even when it was new, still fired on the first crank every spring morning with a puff of blue smoke and an eagerness to work that had not diminished in nearly 25 years of continuous, uncomplaining service. It was still earning its keep, planting, cultivating, raking hay, running the manure spreader, doing the 100 small jobs that keep a 320-acre farm operating between the big events of planting and harvest. Both machines were paid for, just like the land itself, free and clear. No lien filed at the courthouse, no note sitting in a banker's desk drawer, no monthly payment due on the first of the month, with interest accumulating on the unpaid balance at a rate determined by men in distant offices who had never set foot on this ground. The Hargrove farm owed nothing to anyone except the county treasurer who collected the property taxes and God who provided the rain, and neither of those obligations kept Eli awake at night. His father, God rest his soul, had burned that lesson into him with the slow, relentless heat of a man who believed in very few things, but believed in those few things absolutely. The old man had been hard in some ways, not given to embraces or sentimental declarations, a product of his generation and his geography, and the particular school of emotional restraint that the rural Midwest specialized in producing. But he was fierce in his convictions and absolute in his commitment to the principles that had kept the family rooted in this soil when so many other families had been torn loose and scattered by the winds of economic calamity. The bank gives you an umbrella when the sun is shining. Eli, he would say, leaning against the top rail of the fence at the end of a long day with a hand-rolled cigarette between his yellowed fingers and that faraway expression in his eyes that came from carrying memories he rarely discussed, but that informed every decision he made and every piece of advice he offered. And they demand it back the second it starts to rain. Remember that, son. You carry that with you every single day of your life. And when you have a son of your own, you make sure he carries it too. Eli carried it. He had carried it since the first time he heard it at an age when he was too young to fully understand the metaphor, but old enough to recognize the gravity in his father's voice and the weight of lived experience behind the words. His father had told him the story not often, but with a regularity that suggested it was less a story and more a sacrament, something that needed to be repeated at intervals to maintain its power. Eli's grandfather, a man named Harlan Hargrove, had homesteaded this very land at the turn of the century, had broken the virgin prairie sod with a walking plow pulled by a team of draft horses, turning over the thick interwoven mat of grass roots that had been accumulating for 10,000 years, exposing the black earth beneath to sunlight for the first time in geological memory. He had built the first house with his own hands from timber he felled and milled himself using the woodlot along the creek. He had survived the influenza epidemic of 1918 that emptied half the farms in the county and filled the cemetery on the hill. Survived the droughts that turned the fields to dust. Survived the winters that froze cattle where they stood in the pasture and the hailstorms that flattened a season's crop in 20 minutes. And then during the boom that followed the Great War, when wheat prices soared on the wings of European Reconstruction demand, and every banker in the state was pushing loans with the zealous enthusiasm of a revival preacher, pushing salvation. Harlan Hargrove had made the one mistake of his adult life. He had borrowed money. Not an enormous amount by the standards of the era, but enough. Enough to put a note on the land. Enough to give a financial institution a legal claim on the ground that Harlan had broken with his own back and his own horses and his own unrelenting, punishing, magnificent will. And when the bust arrived in the early 20s, when the wartime demand evaporated and the prices collapsed, and the banks began calling their paper with the systematic mechanical efficiency of an institution designed for exactly this purpose, Harlan Hargrove had come within a single missed payment of losing everything he had built. Everything. The house, the barn, the fields, the fences, the well, the garden, the trees he had planted along the lane that were just beginning to provide shade. Every physical manifestation of 20 years of labor balanced on the razor's edge of one payment that he did not have the money to make. He survived by selling the cattle, selling the horses, selling his wife's piano, the one luxury she had permitted herself in a life otherwise defined by sacrifice and practicality and the daily sublimation of personal desire to the needs of the farm, the instrument she played on Sunday evenings when the work was done and the children were quiet, and the music drifting through the open windows was the most beautiful sound in the county. He sold his own pocket watch, a gold Hamilton, that had been a wedding gift from his father-in-law, the most valuable personal possession he owned. He sold everything that could be converted to currency, stripped the family's material life down to the bare minimum required for biological survival, and he walked into the bank on the last possible day with the final payment counted out in coins and crumpled bills on the banker's desk. And he paid the debt, and he walked out into the sunlight, a free man, but also a fundamentally changed man. He never borrowed another dollar for the rest of his life. Not for equipment, not for seed, not for land, not for anything under any circumstances, for any reason, regardless of how favorable the terms or how attractive the opportunity. The philosophy he carried out of that bank was not a business strategy or a financial preference. It was a commandment forged in the furnace of an experience that had nearly destroyed him and it was passed from father to son with the solemnity of a sacred oath. You do not owe what you cannot pay. You do not buy what you have not earned. You keep your hands on your own steering wheel, and you never, not ever, under any circumstances that you can foresee or imagine, let a banker drive your tractor. The auction moved on to the bigger items. A hush fell over the crowd as they reached Dawson's pride and joy, the combine that had broken him. A Gleaner barely 2 years old, its green and silver paint still bright, its header still sharp, its chain still tight. A beautiful machine that had cost a man everything he had spent a lifetime building. Wade Prescott stepped forward, not to bid but to inspect, running a proprietary hand along the sheet metal as if he were already deciding where to park it. He shook his head with a theatrical sigh, pitched for the men nearby to hear. "Shame," he said to Holloway. "Man buys more machine than he has got land to pay for it. A fool's game." Holloway nodded and mopped his brow. He did not mention that his institution had approved the loan. That detail was best left unexamined today. The combine sold to a big outfit from 2 counties over for 60 cents on the dollar, a bargain built on another man's heartbreak. Then Eli's cultivators came up. The auctioneer started at $10. Eli raised a finger. Someone bid 15. Eli went to 20. 25, a voice called. One of Wade's hired hands, a sunburned kid who would rather be anywhere else. Wade stood directly behind him, arms crossed, smirk in place. He did not want the cultivators. Every man in the crowd knew it. He was running the price up. A petty game played for the gallery. Eli dropped his hand. Let him have them. The old set could be welded one more time. It was not about $5. It was about Wade making a point. He had money to burn even on things he did not need, even on the small cruelties of an auction, where a man's world was being parceled out. As the crowd thinned, Wade walked over. "Elijah," he said, using the full name like a finger pressing a bruise. "Picking through the bones. Thought you might bid on that old corn picker. Your speed. Just watching Wade." His voice was flat. "You know Holloway could set you up. A new 966, a bigger plow. You are killing yourself on that old green junk. There is real money to be made, Eli, but you cannot make it pulling 4 bottoms when I am pulling 7. My 4 bottoms are paid for, Wade. How about your 7? The smile tightened, a flicker, a crack. But Eli saw it. It takes money to make money. You are farming like your daddy did in the 50s. This is the 70s. Get big or get out. I know it. I also know Dawson knew it. Look where it got him." He turned and walked to his truck, feeling Wade's eyes on his back the entire way. Driving home, the words echoed. Get big or get out. Maybe Wade was right. Maybe Eli was a dinosaur. But as he pulled into his lane past the mailbox with Hargrove in his father's careful hand and saw the 4020 in the shed solid and waiting, he could not believe it. That tractor was freedom. When Eli turned the key, the only man he answered to was himself. Margaret was on the porch, iced tea in hand, dark hair pulled back, beautiful in the way farm wives are beautiful, a beauty built from strength and early mornings and the quiet competence that does not announce itself. She read his face. How was it Dawson lost everything? Wade played king. I did not get the cultivators. She sat beside him on the step. The evening turned the fields to gold. You did the right thing, she said. He sipped the tea and watched the sun go down over the land that had been in his family 3 generations. Land with no mortgage. Land that would outlast every man at that auction and every piece of machinery they had fought over. The spring of '73 came in wet and cold. The ground was saturated, every farmer itching to get into the fields, standing at the edges of their land each morning, kicking at dirt clumps, hoping they would crumble instead of stick. The new tractors with flotation tires and 4-wheel drive could push in a day or two earlier. Wade's 1066 was already out pulling a disc through ground that was not ready, leaving ruts that would haunt the field for months. He cared about being first. He cared about other farmers seeing his dust cloud and thinking, that man is ahead of me. Eli waited. His 4,022-wheel drive with narrower tires would bog to the axles in wet ground. He had tried it once years ago, spent 4 hours chaining the farmall to the John Deere and pulling it backward out of a hole it had dug for itself. That lesson stayed learned. Patience was a tool, same as a wrench. His father taught him that. The ground will tell you when it is ready. All you have to do is listen. He spent the waiting time in the shop performing the spring ritual, drained the tired winter oil and poured in fresh amber fluid, changed both fuel filters, pulled the air cleaner and checked for pinholes, greased every one of 14 fittings until clean grease pushed the old gray stuff out, ran his hands along the fuel lines feeling for softness, checked the hydraulic fluid in the rear end. It was not maintenance, it was a conversation between a man and his machine, and the 4020 answered back. It was ready. The sun broke through. The wind picked up. The clods crumbled. Eli hitched the planter, connected hydraulic hoses in the PTO shaft with the deliberate motions of a man who does not rush, because rushing leads to mistakes, and mistakes lead to breakdowns, and breakdowns cannot be recovered. He dropped into gear, a week behind Wade. He did not care. The first day was perfect. The diesel sang. The planter dropped seed at precise intervals. The smell of freshly turned earth rose like incense. He worked until the marker track vanished in darkness, drove home under a sky thick with stars, body aching, mind at peace. The second day, the engine's voice changed. A slight miss, a hesitation. Most men would not have heard it, but Eli's ears had been tuned to that engine for years. He heard it the way a mother hears her child cough from 2 rooms away. He throttled back. The miss worsened. The engine sputtered, shook. He clutched it, let it idle. The tractor trembled like a dying animal. He shut it down. The silence was enormous. He sat staring at the half-planted rows behind him and the bare earth ahead. His heart dropped like a stone. He bled the fuel lines. Clean fuel squirted from each injector. Not a clog. The sediment bowl showed a trace of water, not enough to kill it. That left the injector pump. The Rusa master. Precision internals tolerances in 10,000ths of an inch. When it failed, you were dead. He walked 2 miles home, each step heavier. The half-planted field behind him looked like a broken promise. Margaret poured coffee and waited. Injector pump, he said. New one 1,500. Rebuilt maybe 800. Can you install it yourself? The pump, yes. Timing is the thing. Get it wrong and you crack a piston. But I have the manual. The next morning he called Becker's Salvage, 2 counties north. Old man Becker had a voice like grinding gears. A pump for a 4020 diesel. Yeah, I might have one. Off a tractor that burned. Cannot guarantee it. As is. 150. You pull it. He counted the money from the coffee can in the bedroom closet. Margaret's rainy day jar. Drove 60 miles north with the windows down and Merle Haggard on the AM radio. Becker's Salvage was a graveyard of ambition. Rows of dead tractors gaping at the sky. Combines rusting in the weeds. Plows sinking into soft earth. A place where machines came to die, and Eli walked through it with the somber respect of a man in a cemetery. The burned 4020 was in the back row. Paint scorched to charcoal. Tires melted into puddles. Seat a skeleton of springs. But the engine block, protected by its mass, was intact. The pump sat nestled behind a shield of steel. Blackened but apparently whole. 3 hours of fighting seized bolts, brittle fuel lines, impossible angles. Knuckles split and bleeding. Soaked in sweat, grease, soot. But the pump came free. He held it up and turned it. Housing uncracked. Shaft turned smooth. It felt like hope in his hands. Back in his shop, he spent the evening cleaning it under the drop light. Checked for cracks with a magnifying glass. Spun the shaft, listened to the bearings. It looked clean. It looked whole. The next morning, the surgery. Timing marks aligned with the marks on the engine cover, referencing his worn INT manual. Torqued bolts in sequence. Reconnected high-pressure fuel lines. Bled the system, each injector cracked open until clean fuel wept out. He climbed onto the seat, turned the key, pushed the starter. The engine cranked. Once, twice, 3 times. Then it caught. A sputter. Black smoke. Then the mist was gone. The cough resolved into a deep, steady, beautiful idle. He sat there a long time, hand on the throttle, feeling the vibration. The sweetest sound he had ever heard. Total cost $150. 2 days. Sweat and blood. He finished planting 3 days late. Saw Wade's 1066 across the fence disc raising dust. Even from a quarter mile, he felt the judgment. Let him think what he wanted. The truth lived in the quiet places. That autumn, the corn came strong, not record-breaking but honest. 130 bushels on the best ground, 110 on the lighter soil. He harvested with a rented two-row pull-type, slow and loud but cheap, hauled grain to the elevator in his pickup 10 bushels at a time. At the kitchen table that evening, he and Margaret spread the numbers. Income, expenses, seed fuel fertilizer, the pump, combine, rental taxes, insurance, mortgage payment. When every dollar was placed, there was money left. Not a fortune, but enough to refill the rainy day jar, enough for savings, enough for Margaret a winter coat and Nathan boots that were not hand-me-downs. They were not getting ahead in any way the coffee shop would notice, but they were not falling behind. They were holding ground. In farming, that is the first victory. The winter was long and brutal. Snow buried fence posts. Temperature dropped below zero on Thanksgiving and stayed there 3 weeks. Eli used the frozen months to plan. He mapped his fields on graph paper color-coded by soil type and yield history. The wet corner could be tiled with drainage pipe. The thin ridge could be built up with manure from the neighbor's cattle hauled free in exchange for grazing corn stalks. Small improvements. Incremental gains. The kind that never make a headline, but compound over decades into the difference between survival and prosperity. Margaret watched him work at the table, evening's pencil in hand, and saw what the coffee shop could not see. A man who was not standing still. A man moving forward on his own terms. The mid-70s arrived on a wave of prosperity, the likes of which nobody in that part of Iowa had ever witnessed, and few would ever see again. It came dressed in the language of opportunity and smelled like freshly printed money, and it changed people the way a flood changes a landscape, slowly at first, and then all at once, until you could not recognize what had been standing there before the water came. It started with the Russians. A massive grain deal negotiated in the halls of Washington and Moscow by men in suits who had never driven a tractor or walked a bean field or lain awake at night listening to the rain and wondering if it would stop or start open the Soviet Union's doors to American wheat and corn on a scale that staggered the imagination. The ships lined up at the docks in New Orleans and Portland, their holds yawning open, waiting to carry Midwestern grain across the ocean to feed a nation that could not feed itself. Exports surged, and the prices went vertical. A bushel of corn, which had been worth a little over $1 when the decade began, was suddenly fetching $2, then $2.50, then $3, sometimes more. Soybeans climbed even higher. For farmers with grain in the bin and ground to plant, it was like waking up one morning to discover that the dirt under your feet had turned to gold. The banks smelled the money before anyone else. They always do. Mr. Holloway at the Farmers Trust and Savings underwent a transformation so complete it was almost physical, trading in his cautious, avuncular manner for something closer to evangelical fervor. He was no longer the careful steward of his depositors' savings, the conservative small-town banker in the brown suit who weighed every loan against the worst case and counseled prudence. He was a salesman now, a promoter, a man with a product to move, and that product was debt. Use our money, not yours, became his new catechism. He repeated it with the frequency and conviction of a man who has found religion and wants everyone around him to be saved. He said it to every farmer who walked through his polished oak door. He said it at the Rotary Club luncheon and at the Lions Club dinner and at the county fair, where the bank's booth featured a banner that proclaimed "Growing Together" in green and gold letters and offered free balloons and loan applications to anyone who stopped to chat. He said it with such sincerity that you almost forgot, listening to him, that what he was actually offering was not generosity, but a contract, and that every contract has terms, and that terms have consequences, and that consequences do not care about sincerity. Land values doubled, then tripled. A man's net worth on paper could increase by $100,000 in a single year simply by sitting in his kitchen and watching the appraised value of his ground climb like the mercury in a thermometer on an August afternoon. The key phrase was "on paper." Paper was easy. Paper was accommodating. Paper would hold any number you cared to write on it and would not object or question or warn you that the number might be imaginary. Paper was infinitely patient, and that patience in a time of irrational exuberance was the most dangerous quality in the world. The phrase on everyone's lips was "fence row to fence row." It was spoken with the confidence of a commandment handed down from a mountaintop. Old pastures that had been home to cattle for 50 years, grassland, that had been the ecological anchor of the landscape were plowed under and planted to corn. Conservation terraces that the Soil Conservation Service had painstakingly constructed during the Dust Bowl recovery of the 50s, contour strips and grassed waterways, and check dams designed to stop the topsoil from washing into the creeks, and the creeks from carrying it into the rivers, were bulldozed flat because they interfered with the turning radius of the big new equipment, and because every square foot they occupied was a square foot that was not producing revenue. Every acre that could hold a seed was pressed into production to chase the golden prices that everyone in the county, everyone in the state, everyone in the entire agricultural heartland believed with the unshakable faith of true believers had become a permanent feature of the economic landscape. Wade Prescott did not just ride this wave, he surfed it. He became the poster child for the new era, the living embodiment of the philosophy that bigger was always better and more was never enough. He used his rapidly inflating land values as collateral to borrow sums of money that would have made his own father a conservative man who had farmed 160 acres his entire adult life and owed no one a dime fall out of his chair and possibly require medical attention. He bought the 400 acres that bordered Eli's farm to the north, paying a price per acre that made the old-timers at the co-op set down their coffee cups and stare at each other in uncomprehending silence. He did not stop there. He picked up another half section on the far side of the county, and then a quarter section after that, and then another piece that connected two of his existing tracks and allowed him to make a 3-mile-long pass with the disc without having to cross a public road. His operation swelled past 2,000 acres, a number that sounded less like a family farm and more like a small agricultural corporation. His machinery grew to match the scale of the ambition that drove it. The 1066 was traded for a new 1466, its turbocharged engine producing a sound like a jet airplane warming up on a runway as it dragged an ever bigger plow through ground that had never been asked to give this much. Then came the machine that would become the centerpiece of the story, the crown jewel of the Prescott Empire, the artifact that would symbolize the era more completely than any single object in the county's collective memory. A Steiger Panther ST320, a giant articulated four-wheel drive tractor that looked less like a piece of farm equipment and more like something designed by the military for crossing hostile terrain under fire. It was painted the signature Steiger lime green, a color so vivid it seemed almost fluorescent in the Iowa sunshine. It sat on 8 massive tires, each one taller than a grown man, and its Detroit diesel engine, a supercharged two-stroke that produced over 300 horsepower, emitted a sound that could be heard from 2 miles away, a deep industrial earth-shaking roar that rattled the windows in nearby farmhouses and sent a tremor through the ground that you could feel in your feet. When it passed on the road, people stopped whatever they were doing and watched. Children on school buses pressed their faces to the glass. Dogs barked. Old men on porches shook their heads. It was for a brief and intoxicating moment in the history of American farming, the most impressive piece of machinery that anyone in that county had ever seen, and owning it conferred upon Wade Prescott a status that no amount of ordinary success could have provided. He drove it past Eli's place on the way to his fields, the earth trembling beneath those 8 tires, and he gave a little wave from inside his air-conditioned cab, a wave that carried more meaning than any words could have conveyed. Look at this. Look at what I have built. Look at what happens when a man has the courage to borrow and the vision to expand. This is the future. This is what real farming looks like. And this is what you are missing, Eli Hargrove, standing there on your 320 paid-for acres with your second-hand tractor and your grandfather's antique, watching the parade go by from the sidewalk while the rest of us are riding the floats. Eli confessed privately. There were moments of doubt. He was making the best money of his life. Margaret had new curtains, a working washer. They ate steak on Saturdays. Nathan was growing, already handing tools in the shop. But the philosophy held. While Wade bought land and iron, Eli killed debt. Double payments, triple payments, every spare dollar to the mortgage principal. On a Tuesday in the autumn of '76, he walked into the Farmers Trust wearing his good shirt, an envelope with a check. He handed it to Holloway. This pays off the mortgage. Holloway folded his hands. Have you considered leveraging this equity to expand? Rates are favorable. Values are climbing. You could double your operation. I came to pay off a debt not take on a new one. Process the check. Holloway sighed, stamped the satisfaction of mortgage, and handed it over. Eli folded it into his shirt pocket and walked out into the sunlight. The sidewalk felt different. The air tasted different. The farm his grandfather homesteaded was completely, irrevocably theirs. He used the surplus wisely. New roof, steel siding on the barn. Margaret a Chevrolet sedan. He found a John Deere 443 with the Soundguard cab at an estate sale. Few years old, meticulous, previous owner. Paid cash. The 4020 moved to lighter duties. Mowing, running the auger, the small jobs. He could not have sold that tractor any more than he could have sold his right arm. That night, Margaret waited until Nathan was in bed, then sat beside Eli on the porch. The air smelled of corn tasseling. "You paid it off," she said, not a question. He nodded. Silence. Then Eli, "Do you ever wonder if we are making a mistake?" "Not the mortgage. But the Prescotts have a new house, central air, a swimming pool. The Langfords have a new car. Everyone is growing. We are standing still." He took her hand and led her to the porch edge. Fields lay silver under the moon. "Everything you see, every acre, every fence post, it belongs to us, not us and the bank. To us. If corn drops to $1, we still own this ground. Nobody can take it. Nobody can send a letter. The Prescotts have nice things, but they own them the way a man owns a rented suit. Looks wonderful until someone asks for it back. What we have is ours, really ours." Something shifted behind her eyes, not just acceptance, understanding. She squeezed his hand. Two people who had chosen the harder road and knew exactly why. The years between 76 and 79 were the great acceleration. Wade built a ranch house with brick veneer, two-car garage, wall-to-wall carpet. Carol chose the fixtures. It sat on a rise overlooking fields like a monument to hypothetical success. Eli's improvements came one at a time. Kitchen floor, bathroom fixtures, double-pane windows for Nathan's bedroom. Each paid before the next began. Not glamorous, but permanent and unencumbered. At the co-op, Eli was an afterthought. Small time, never took a chance. They saw Wade's equipment in his pole building a structure that could house an airliner. They saw thousands of acres. They saw success. Then they looked at Eli's 320 acres in secondhand 443 and saw a man the world had left behind. Tommy Langford was 26, full of fire and borrowed confidence. 300 acres on his father-in-law's co-signature. Leased tractor, monthly payments. He worshipped Wade the way a young soldier worships a general. One afternoon, fixing fence together, "Wade says a man not growing is dying," Tommy said. "I am looking at another quarter section." Eli measured his words. "What happens if corn goes to $1.50? If it does not rain? If interest rates go up?" Tommy laughed. "The market is strong. The banks would not lend if it was not safe. That is what they told Dawson. Look where it got him." The smile faltered, then rebuilt. "That was different. I am being smart about it." Eli drove another staple and said nothing more. A man can lead a horse to water. In the spring of 79, Wade stopped at Eli's lane. "That little 80 of yours on the corner messes up my long rows. I would make you a hell of an offer. It is not for sale. Everything is for sale. Take the money. Retire. I am not killing myself. I am living. This farm is 3 generations. Not for sale. Not a single acre." Wade shook his head. "You are stubborn, Eli Hargrove. This boom will last forever." He drove off. The words hung in the air like a curse that did not know what it was. Eli was a student of history. Not the academic kind with footnotes and citations, but the kind taught at kitchen tables by old men who were there when it happened. His father had told him about the post-Great War boom and the bust that followed. Trees do not grow to the sky. Every fat year is followed by a lean one. The only question was when. As the decade ended, the signs appeared. Diesel prices crept up, then jumped. Fertilizer costs climbed. On the nightly news, the anchorman spoke about the Federal Reserve raising the prime rate. Technical language dry as dust. But Eli heard it the way a sailor hears the wind shift. Something fundamental was turning over in the deep currents of the economy, and when it surfaced, it was going to break things that people believed were permanent. He told Margaret one evening while she balanced their ledger at the kitchen table, her pencil moving in careful columns. "The rates are going up. How high? Higher than they should. higher than a lot of people plan for. What does that mean for us? For us, nothing. We do not owe a dime. For Wade and Tommy and half this county, it could mean everything. The summer of 1980 arrived hot and breathless and stayed that way as if the season had decided to abandon its normal rhythms and settle into a single relentless mode of punishment. The sky baked to a pale, hazy blue. The rain stopped completely, like someone closing a valve. Day after day, the sun hammered the cornfields with the patient, unstoppable force of something that has nowhere else to be and all the time in the world to do its work. The corn leaves curled inward during the heat of the afternoon, folding into tight cylinders to conserve what little moisture remained in their cells, a biological prayer directed at a sky that had nothing to offer. At night, they uncurled slightly, reaching upward into darkness that brought no relief. Each morning, they uncurled a little less. Each afternoon, they curled a little tighter. Eli walked his rows before dawn, running his hand along stalks that should have been green and thick with vitality and were instead papery and dry, and already beginning the long surrender to a drought that showed no signs of breaking. His costs were fixed. Seed in the ground, fuel in the tank, fertilizer applied in March, all committed. The drought was consuming the expected return the way fire consumes stacked paper. But because he had no loans, no monthly payments, no interest accruing on borrowed capital, the drought was a punch to the gut. Hard. The kind that bends you double and makes you see stars. But not fatal. A man without debt absorbs a bad year the way a healthy body absorbs a fever. You suffer. You sweat through the sheets. But you survive because nothing is feeding on you from outside. For Wade Prescott, the drought was the first cut of a death by 1,000 wounds. His operating loan for that year was a number so large that when Eli heard it mentioned at the co-op, he had to ask the man who said it to repeat it because he thought he had misheard. It covered the diesel for the Steiger, which consumed fuel the way a furnace consumes coal, at a rate that would have powered Eli's for an entire season in a matter of weeks. It covered the tons of anhydrous ammonia that had been knifed into the soil at precisely calibrated rates determined by the agronomist. Wade had hired a young man with a degree from Iowa State and a computer program that calculated fertilizer needs down to the pound per acre. It covered the specialized herbicides, the crop insurance premiums, the interest on the land he had purchased at boom prices, the monthly payments on equipment that was depreciating faster than the loans against it were being paid down. He had structured his entire operation on the assumption that corn would bring at least $2.75 a bushel and that yields would hold at 150 bushels per acre. And when both of those assumptions failed simultaneously, the mathematics of his situation changed from challenging to catastrophic, with the speed and totality of a light switch being turned off. One afternoon in late July, when the heat index had pushed past 105 degrees and the air felt like the exhaust from a dryer vent, and every living thing in the county was either dying or desperately trying not to. Eli was driving past Wade's main farmstead on his way to check a fence line along the creek bottom. He saw the Steiger parked at an odd angle near the machine shed, not in his usual spot of honor, at the front of the building where it could be seen from the road, but off to the side, pushed back as if it had been driven there, in a hurry by someone who wanted to get it out of sight as quickly as possible. A dealer's service truck, a heavy-duty pickup with a hydraulic crane mounted on the bed, and the International Harvester logo on the door was backed up beside it. The crane was extended and a chain hoist was suspended from its arm, and two mechanics in coveralls that were dark with sweat were standing near the massive articulated joint that connected the front and rear halves of the tractor, the pivot point around which the Steiger's entire 16-ton body bent when it turned. They were shaking their heads. Not quickly, not dramatically, but with the slow, measured side-to-side motion of men who have arrived at a diagnosis they wish they did not have to deliver and are trying to figure out the best way to explain to the owner that his $250,000 machine is going to need work that will cost more than most people earn in a year. Wade was 10 yards away, pacing in tight circles on the gravel, his arms cutting the air in sharp gestures that might have been frustration or might have been fear or were probably both indistinguishable in their intensity. Even from the road 100 yards distant, Eli could read the body language clearly enough. He had seen that kind of pacing before. It was the movement of a man who has just been told something he does not want to hear and is trying to walk it off the way you might try to walk off a punch. A week later, one of those mechanics told Eli the full story at the parts counter. Transmission shot, planetary gears destroyed. North of 10,000 in parts, 2 to 3 weeks lead time from Fargo. And that was parts alone. $10,000 for parts alone. More than Eli paid for the 4430. Then the grain embargo. Politicians in Washington decided to use American grain as a weapon against the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. Men who had never walked a bean field or greased a bearing chose to punish Moscow by destroying the livelihoods of the farmers who had trusted the export market to remain open. The ships stopped loading at the docks. The foreign buyers disappeared. The price of corn did not decline gradually. It fell off a cliff from $3 to $2.50, then $2, then below $2, falling with the sickening acceleration of something that has lost all upward force and is being pulled by gravity toward a bottom that nobody can see. The Steiger sat idle through the rest of summer and all of fall. It did not move from where it had broken down. The lime green paint faded and chalked. The tires lost pressure, going soft and cracked. It sat there enormous and useless, a monument to the specific kind of ambition that looks up but forgets to look around. Wade hired a neighbor with a smaller tractor to do his fall tillage, a humiliation that traveled through the county's conversation like ink through clear water. Everyone knew. Everyone talked about it in low voices over morning coffee. His fertilizer payments stopped. The fuel co-op put him on cash only. He stood at the pump counting bills while a teenager watched with the uncomfortable pity of youth for the troubles it cannot yet understand. The whispers at the coffee shop changed from envy to morbid curiosity. How long could a man tread water with a Steiger chained to his ankle? Tommy Langford was sinking too. He found Eli at the co-op, the fire gone from his eyes. Holloway wants me to come in, review my position. What does that mean? It means the numbers do not add up. Tell the truth. Show everything. Cut to the bone and hold on. Tommy nodded, his eyes already far away and falling. Eli felt no vindication, only a deep and chilling sadness. The storm was here. It would carry away everything not anchored to solid ground. And so much of what people believed was solid was nothing more than paper and promises, and the terrible faith that tomorrow would always be as good as today. The new decade opened with the Federal Reserve cranking the prime rate toward the unthinkable. 10%, 12, 15. At its terrifying apex in the early months of '81, it grazed 21%, a number so far beyond the planning horizon of any farmer who had signed a variable rate loan in 1976 or 77, that it belonged not to the world of finance, but to the world of natural disaster, an earthquake or a tornado, or a flood that arrives without warning and changes the geography of a life in a matter of minutes. For Eli, an abstraction on a television screen, a number spoken by an anchorman in a blue suit who probably did not know what a PTO shaft was. For Wade and thousands like him across the American Farm Belt who had financed their dreams of expansion on variable rate notes during the golden years, when money was cheap and optimism was free, and nobody questioned the assumption that good times were permanent, 21% was the mathematical equivalent of a death sentence. Every dollar Wade owed the bank was suddenly costing him more than twice what it had cost when he signed the papers. His interest payments, alone the cost of merely servicing the debt without reducing the principal by a single cent, exceeded the gross income from his entire operation. There were not enough bushels in the bin, not enough acres under the plow, not enough hours in the day or days in the year to generate the cash required to keep pace with a debt that was growing faster than any crop God or nature or human effort could produce. Holloway stopped making eye contact with anyone who farmed. Certified letters replaced handshakes. The bank itself was hemorrhaging, drowning in the bad agricultural loans it had so enthusiastically originated during the boom. State regulators descended on the institution with briefcases full of spreadsheets and faces full of the grim determination of men who have a job to do and no interest in being liked while doing it. Holloway's suits hung loose on a frame that seemed to be shrinking from the inside out, not just physically but spiritually, as if the knowledge of his role in the catastrophe was consuming him the way the interest was consuming his borrowers. The collapse arrived not as a single dramatic event, but as a steady, methodical dismantlement. A flatbed from the international dealer backed into Wade's lane one Monday morning, and two men in company jackets with carefully neutral expressions presented papers and winched the 1466 onto the trailer. They worked with the clinical efficiency of men who have performed this procedure many times and have learned to do it quickly because speed is a kindness when the alternative is prolonging a humiliation that the man watching from his kitchen window will remember for the rest of his life. The next week, the bank lined the stored grain. Every bushel, every dollar straight to the bank. A cup of water on a house fire. Foreclosure notices filled the legal section of the county paper with a density that made the page look like the obituary section of a city newspaper after a catastrophe. Good families. Families who had farmed the same ground for 3 and 4 generations, who had buried parents and raised children, and celebrated golden anniversaries on that land. Erased. The get big or get out gospel had become a prophecy, but the cruelest kind, the kind that destroys the people who believed in it most fervently. Tommy Langford fell among the first, and he fell hard, and he fell fast. The boy who had laughed at Eli's caution and called Wade Prescott a visionary lost everything he had acquired and everything his family had put at risk on his behalf in the span of 6 terrible weeks. The bank took the quarter section he had bought on Frank Morrow's co-signature, and the taking of that land destroyed not just a business relationship, but a family bond that had been built on love and trust and the assumption that a father-in-law's guarantee was a safe bet because the young man who asked for it was smart and hardworking and had the backing of the finest banker in the county. Frank Morrow, who had put his own farm up as security, was left holding a debt that would shadow the remainder of his working life and turn every Sunday dinner from a celebration into an exercise in the management of unspoken resentment. Tommy packed what would fit into the station wagon. His wife held the baby in the front seat, and the older child sat in the back surrounded by boxes of clothes and dishes and the framed wedding photograph that had hung in their hallway. They drove east in the dark before dawn, before the neighbors could see them leave because the shame of departure is always worse when there are witnesses. To what destination, nobody in the county knew. Perhaps a factory job in Davenport or Moline. Perhaps a relative's spare bedroom in a city where nobody knew what they had lost. Perhaps to the specific kind of nowhere that waits for people who have lost everything except each other and have not yet figured out whether that is enough. Eli drove past the empty house the day after. Curtains gone, yard already starting to grow wild, a child's red bicycle on its side near the porch steps too small to have been worth the space in an already packed car left behind in the early morning hurry of a departure that was not a departure at all, but a retreat, a flight, the abandonment of a position that could no longer be held. He sat in his truck at the end of that empty lane for a long time, engine idling, hands on the wheel, looking at that bicycle and thinking about the boy who had ridden it and the father who had bought it, and the promises that had been made in that house about the future and the life they were going to build, promises that had been perfectly sincere and perfectly hopeful and perfectly wrong. The crisis spread beyond the farms into the towns and the businesses that depended on the farming economy the way branches depend on the trunk. Implement dealers closed. Hardware stores went dark. Restaurants shuttered. Main Street emptied. School enrollment dropped. Church pews thinned. The volunteer fire department lost half its members. The fabric of the community woven over decades from the interlocking threads of commerce and charity and neighborliness began to fray and pull apart. Eli did what he could, hired Tommy's father-in-law, Frank Morrow, for fall harvest, paid fair wages in cash, bought a side of beef from a rancher liquidating at fire sale prices, and split it with 2 families stretching groceries to the breaking point, fixed a neighbor's clutch for free on a Saturday lying under the tractor because the man could not afford the dealer's rate and could not afford to be without the machine during planting. Margaret organized a food drive through church, drove Carol Prescott to the doctor when Carol was too ashamed to ask for a ride because the second car had been repossessed, sat with wives of foreclosed farmers in half-empty kitchens and listened without judgment. They were building something during those dark years that could not be measured in acres. A reputation carried in the hearts of people helped when help was most needed. Small acts, invisible acts, noticed by the people who received them and remembered in ways that the givers could not have predicted. Eli survived on discipline so strict it was ritual. His fuel bill was a fraction of what the Steiger consumed. When a hydraulic hose burst on the planter, he bought a replacement for $19 and fixed it in an hour. He heard a neighbor waited 3 days for a dealer mechanic to replace an electronic sensor. His books were kept at the kitchen table. Pencil ledger Margaret's handwriting. Cost of production to the penny. Even at $2 a bushel, he could break even. Because breaking even when you owe no one is surviving. And surviving in a disaster is winning. Wade could not break even at $10. His debt service consumed more monthly than Eli spent annually. The end came on a raw March day in '82. Foreclosure posted on the courthouse door, the paper flapping in a cold wind, the ink still wet and sharp against the legal-sized sheet. The farmer's trust and savings itself, teetering on the edge of regulatory intervention, was calling in its largest remaining exposure. Everything to be sold: land, equipment, house, outbuildings, grain bins, fencing, every physical remnant of a life's work cataloged and numbered and assigned to lots that would be sold to the highest bidder on the courthouse steps, with the mechanical indifference of a legal system that processes loss the way a meatpacking plant processes cattle. 2 weeks before the sale, on a gray Tuesday afternoon, when the wind was sharp enough to make your eyes water and the sky looked like it had been painted with dirty dishwater, Eli was at the parts store in town. He needed plowshares for the spring tillage that would begin as soon as the frost left the ground, the annual act of faith that every farmer performs, regardless of what the markets are doing or what the economists are predicting. Because if you do not prepare the ground, you cannot plant the seed. And if you do not plant the seed, you cannot harvest the crop. And if you do not harvest the crop, you are not a farmer, you are just a man with a lot of dirt. The bell above the door jingled its small, bright note, and Wade Prescott walked in. Or rather, something that had once been Wade Prescott walked in the way a building that has been damaged by fire still bears the shape and outline of the structure it used to be while being fundamentally, irreversibly altered in every important respect. This man was thin in the particular way that anxiety produces not the leanness of a man who exercises or diets, but the hollowed-out concave quality of a body that has been consuming itself from the inside, burning muscle and fat, and the reserves of health that a man accumulates during the good years and draws upon during the bad ones. His face had a gray, translucent quality, the skin stretched over bones that seemed closer to the surface than they should have been, and there were shadows under his eyes that looked like bruises and probably were in a sense because sleepless nights leave their marks on a man's face as surely as any physical blow. His clothes, which had once been chosen with the deliberate attention of a man who understood that appearance is a form of currency, hung on his frame as if they had been tailored for someone one size larger, which in a way they had been because the man who had bought those clothes no longer existed. He walked to the counter and asked the clerk, a young woman in a green apron, who could not have been more than 20 years old, for a battery. A 12-volt automotive battery, the kind you put in a passenger car. His wife Carol's sedan. He spoke the request in a voice that was quieter than the voice Eli remembered, stripped of the volume and the projection and the instinctive need to be heard that had once been Wade Prescott's defining characteristic. The clerk found the battery on the shelf behind the counter, set it on the scarred formica surface, and rang it up on the register. The total appeared on the display. Wade reached into his back pocket and produced a credit card, a thin rectangle of plastic that had once been a passport to any purchase in any store in the county, a token of credit worthiness that merchants accepted without hesitation because it bore the name of a man who was known to be solvent and successful and backed by the full faith and credit of the Farmers Trust and Savings Bank. The clerk ran the card through the electronic reader. There was a pause, a silence that occupied perhaps 3 seconds of clock time, but that seemed to stretch and expand until it filled the entire store like water filling a glass, rising from the floor to the counter to the ceiling. The machine beeped. The clerk looked at the small screen, then looked up at Wade with the particular facial expression that people in retail develop over time for the delivery of information they know will cause distress, a slight tightening of the lips, a marginal rise of the eyebrows, an expression that says, "I am sorry about this, but it is not my fault, and there is nothing I can do." The card was declined. Wade's face went through a series of transformations that Eli, standing 6 feet away at the end of the counter, wished with his entire heart he had not been positioned to witness. Surprise came first, the genuine kind, the kind that widens the eyes and parts the lips, because even a man who is losing everything does not expect to be denied a car battery on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon. Then denial, a quick shake of the head, a half-formed sentence that started with, "There must be some kind of error," and died halfway through because the man speaking it heard the words coming out of his mouth and realized they were not true. Then shame, a deep, total physical shame that rose from somewhere below the conscious mind and flooded every visible surface of the man's body, coloring his neck and his ears and his cheeks and the bridge of his nose with a dark red flush that was not anger, but its close cousin. The particular hue that the human body produces when the gap between who you believe yourself to be and who you are revealed to be in public becomes so wide that the body itself protests. Wade fumbled in the pockets of his coat, and then in the pockets of his jeans, the movements urgent and clumsy, the hands not quite steady. He produced a collection of bills, crumpled and folded and jammed into various compartments, the way money ends up when a man is no longer organized enough or prosperous enough to carry a proper wallet. He smoothed them flat on the counter one by one, pressing the wrinkles out of each bill with fingers that trembled slightly, aligning the edges, counting. A 10, a 5, 3 ones. A pause, another pocket, another 5. He counted again, his lips moving, the arithmetic visible on his face. He was $5 short. The silence that followed was the loudest sound Eli Hargrove had ever experienced in his life. Louder than the roar of the Detroit diesel in the machine shed. Louder than the auctioneer's voice at Dawson's sale. Louder than the engine of the 4020 catching for the first time on the salvage pump. It was the sound of the absolute zero of human dignity, the temperature at which pride can no longer maintain its molecular structure and simply ceases to exist. Eli reached into the back pocket of his work jeans where he kept his wallet, a plain brown leather billfold that his father had given him on his 18th birthday and that he had carried every day since. He opened it and found a $5 bill, one of 3 that were there, and he laid it on the counter beside Wade's money. He did it without ceremony, without eye contact, without comment, with the simple, unhesitating directness of a man who sees a thing that needs to be done and does it the way you would hand a cup of water to someone who was thirsty or a coat to someone who was cold. Wade looked at the $5 bill. Then he looked at Eli. And what Eli saw in those eyes was something he had never seen there before in all the years they had known each other and competed against each other and judged each other from opposite sides of a philosophical divide. The arrogance was gone. The swagger was gone. The condescension and the pity and the certainty and the need to dominate and the compulsion to be the biggest and the loudest and the most conspicuously successful person in every room he entered, all of it was gone, evaporated, burned away. And what remained in those eyes was nothing except pain, raw, unprocessed, total pain. The pain of a man who has been stripped of everything that he used to define himself and has discovered in the stripping that the definition was all there was, and that underneath it there is nothing except fear, and the terrible realization that fear was there all along, hiding behind the machinery and the acreage and the borrowed money, and that every boast and every purchase and every expansion had been an attempt to build a wall high enough to keep the fear out of sight. And now the wall was gone, and the fear was standing there in plain view, undisguised and unconcealed, and terrible in its simplicity. "I cannot take that," Wade whispered. His voice was barely audible, the voice of a man speaking from the bottom of a well. "It is not alone," Eli said. His own voice was low and steady, carrying the particular calm that comes to a man when he knows exactly what he is doing and why he is doing it and has no doubt about either. It is not charity either. It is one farmer helping another. You pay it forward. Someday, somewhere, someone else will need $5. You will be the man who has it. That is all. Wade stood there. The clerk stood there. Eli stood there. The fluorescent lights hummed. The clock on the wall behind the register ticked off seconds that nobody was counting. Then Wade nodded. Once, a single sharp economical dip of his chin, the kind of nod a man gives when his throat is closed and his eyes are burning, and the only form of communication available to him is the simplest possible physical gesture. He picked up the battery with both hands turned, walked to the door, and pushed through it without looking back. The bell above the door rang a single bright note behind him, a sound so incongruously cheerful in the context of what had just occurred that it seemed to belong to a different reality entirely. The auction day arrived gray and bitter and merciless with a wind out of the northwest that came across 300 miles of open prairie, without meeting a single obstacle tall enough to slow it down and hit the courthouse square with a force that cut through every layer of clothing and found the bones beneath and chilled them to the marrow. The temperature had not climbed above freezing since dawn and was showing no ambition to try. The sky was the color of used concrete, flat and featureless, and low, pressing down on the landscape like a lid on a pot. The crowd that assembled on the frozen lawn in front of the courthouse was a congregation of the damned. Not the damned in the theological sense, but in the agricultural sense, which in Iowa in 1982 amounted to very nearly the same thing. These were the survivors, the men and women who had managed through luck or caution or some combination of the two to avoid the fate that was being enacted today on the courthouse steps. They wore their survival like a visible burden, their faces carved with the complex emotional topography of people who feel simultaneous pity for the fallen and terror that they might be next, and guilty relief that at least for today, the name on the notice is not their own. Every person in that crowd was thinking the same unspoken thought, carrying it behind their eyes like a stone in a pocket. There but for the grace of bone and the absence of a variable rate loan go I. Mr. Holloway stood beside the auctioneer on the courthouse steps, clipboard in hand, looking as though the past 18 months had aged him 2 decades. Wade and Carol stood apart from the crowd off to one side near the leafless elm trees. Two figures so still and so pale they might have been carved from the same gray stone as the courthouse itself. Carol was holding Wade's arm with both hands, gripping it with the intensity of someone who is not reaching for warmth or comfort, but for the basic physical reassurance that the person beside her is still solid, still real, still present in a world that has become so strange and so hostile that nothing can be taken for granted. They sold the land first. The boom-era acquisitions, the parcels Wade had assembled during the golden years at prices that now read like figures from a hallucination. The bidding was agonizingly slow, each number spoken into the cold air and hanging there like breath visible in the freezing temperature. Investment groups from Des Moines and Chicago, men in overcoats with leather gloves, who had driven up that morning in heated cars with spreadsheets already completed on the seats beside them, bought everything for fractions of the original cost. Cold money, calculated money, money that felt nothing and feared nothing and would wait with infinite patience for the cycle to turn. Then came the Steiger, positioned directly in front of the courthouse steps like an exhibit in a trial, like evidence presented to a jury that had already reached its verdict. The Steiger Panther sat on the frozen grass in all its diminished glory. It had been repaired enough to qualify as operational for the purposes of the sale, the transmission patched rather than properly rebuilt, the minimum intervention necessary to allow the auctioneer to describe it as a running tractor rather than a piece of scrap metal. But it had not worked a field in over a year, and that year of idleness was written across every surface of the machine in a language that anyone who knew equipment could read fluently. The paint, the signature Steiger lime green, that had once been bright enough to see from a mile away, vivid enough to make you squint in direct sunlight, was faded now to a pale, chalky approximation of its former self, the clear coat cracked and peeling in patches that exposed the primer beneath like wounds showing through a bandage. The 8 massive tires, each one representing hundreds of dollars of specialized rubber engineering, were weather-cracked and flat-spotted. The sidewalls dried and checked by months of exposure to ultraviolet radiation and temperature extremes without the protective conditioning that regular use provides. The cab windows were streaked with a film of grime and mineral deposits from the rain that had dried on them, and the dust that had accumulated in the bird droppings that nobody had cleaned because nobody had any reason to clean the windows of a machine that was not going anywhere. A wasp had built a small paper nest under the left mirror. A mouse had chewed through one of the rubber seals around the cab door, leaving a hole through which the wind whistled and the rain seeped. The battery was dead. The coolant had been drained to prevent freeze damage, and the empty radiator hoses hung slack against the grill like deflated veins. It sat there enormous and silent and impotent, the most visible and most symbolic artifact of the entire era. A machine that had been designed and marketed as the ultimate expression of agricultural ambition, and that had delivered on that promise in the most literal and most devastating way possible. It had enabled a man to farm more ground than he could afford, to burn more fuel than he could pay for, to take on more debt than he could service. And when it broke, when a single $12 bearing deep inside its transmission failed, and took the planetary gears with it. The cascade of consequences that followed had not stopped at the boundary of the machine shed, but had continued outward through the fences, in the fields, in the bank accounts, in the family, in the community, until it reached the courthouse steps where the auctioneer now stood, his breath visible in the cold air, his gavel in his hand, his voice trying to find a buyer for the monument to the American farm crisis. The auctioneer started at $50,000. His voice carried the forced confidence of a professional who knows the number is too high, but must start somewhere because the bank is watching, and the bank needs to see that every reasonable effort was made. The crowd was motionless. Nobody raised a hand or a finger or an eyebrow. Nobody shifted their weight from one foot to the other. The silence was so absolute that Eli could hear the wind moving through the bare branches of the elm trees at the edge of the courthouse square, a dry, skeletal whispering sound that seemed like commentary. 40,000, will anyone give me 40? Nothing. 30,000. Come on, folks. This is a Steiger tractor. Panther model, four-wheel drive, 300 horsepower Detroit diesel. You know what these machines are worth. The irony of that last sentence hung in the air like the visible breath of the men who heard it. Yes, they knew what it was worth. They were looking at what it was worth. It was worth the destruction of the man who had bought it, and the near destruction of the bank that had financed it, and the impoverishment of the community that had admired it. That was what it was worth, and nobody wanted to own that. 20,000, 15. The auctioneer's voice was losing its professional composure, the forced cheer giving way to something closer to pleading. $10,000, he said, and there was nothing left to hide behind. Somebody give me 10,000 for this tractor. Holloway was sweating visibly, despite the cold, his forehead shining under the gray sky. That machine represented one of the largest single items on the bank's recovery list, and every dollar it failed to generate. And at this auction was a dollar that would appear on the bank's balance sheet as a loss that the state regulators would scrutinize and question and use as evidence in their ongoing assessment of whether the farmer's trust and savings was solvent enough to continue operating. A thought formed in Eli's mind. It arrived fully formed, complete and clear, like a sentence that writes itself. Not pride, not revenge, not the satisfaction of watching an adversary brought low. It was something simpler and more practical than any of those. Closing a chapter. Putting a period at the end of a sentence that had been running on for far too long. 5,000, he said. Relief flooded the auctioneer's voice. Will anyone give 6? He scanned the crowd. Nobody moved. 5,000, going once, twice. Sold. To Eli Hargrove. A ripple through the crowd. He walked to Holloway and wrote a check. Then the home place, Wade's father's 160, the house where the children were born. Carol's Sunday bread. This was not just land, this was family bedrock. Carol wept. Wade held her, watching his life sold syllable by syllable. An out-of-state investment group bid. Eli countered. Back and forth. He was not thinking price per acre. He was thinking about $5 on a counter, about a man's face stripped bare in public. The investor stepped back. Numbers passed what his spreadsheet allowed. Sold. To Eli Hargrove. He stood motionless. Wind whipped leaves across the steps. The crowd dispersed in hushed groups. He had doubled his farm in an afternoon. All cash, no triumph, setting a broken bone. He walked to where Wade stood. You came to pick the bones clean after all. Wade's voice was barely audible. I guess you were right. No, I came to stop the bleeding. The home place, I want you to rent it from me. You and Carol, you stay. You farm it. We will work out shares. You are a good farmer, Wade. You just got caught in a storm bigger than any man. Wade stared, mouth open, closed. For the first time in every year Eli had known him, he had nothing to say. Then something moved behind his eyes. Not hope, something smaller, a pilot light in a dead furnace. He nodded once, turned and wrapped his arms around Carol. The sound of a man weeping without restraint was the most private thing Eli had ever heard. He turned and walked away. The only gift he could give in that moment was the dignity of grief without an audience. The drive home was the longest 12 miles of his life. Margaret waited on the porch in the cold, a blanket over her knees. She had heard from a neighbor. How much, he told her. The Steiger, the home place, can we carry it? We'll not feel it. Cash, no debt. What about Wade and Carol? He told her. She was quiet. Then, That was the right thing. Your father would have been proud. They stood together looking at fields that extended farther than ever. More land meant more work, more responsibility, but also more security for Nathan and generations that might follow. The paperwork was done Tuesday at the courthouse. Holloway processed the transfers without speaking, looking like a man who would carry the knowledge of his role in this suffering for the rest of his professional life. Eli stopped at the end of his lane, looked at the farm, house, barn, shed, fields to every tree line. He thought about Harlan, who nearly lost it, his father, who refined caution into philosophy, Nathan, who was 7 and did not yet understand but would, and Wade standing in the kitchen that was no longer his, looking at fields that were no longer his. Eli felt no triumph, only complicated sorrow. An adversary recognized as fundamentally no different from himself. A man who wanted to provide for his family and chose the wrong road and paid for it with everything. In the years that followed, the land began to heal. Slowly, the way land always heals on its own schedule, answering to rhythms that predate human ambition and will outlast human memory. The rains returned, not all at once, not in the dramatic fashion of a drought breaking with a single thunderstorm, but gradually, week by week, season by season, the moisture creeping back into the soil profile like blood returning to a limb that has been too long compressed. The corn grew taller each summer. The yields improved. The fields that had been pushed to exhaustion during the fence row to fence row frenzy of the boom years rested and recovered their depleted organic matter, slowly rebuilding their compacted subsoils, slowly loosening as the freeze-thaw cycles of winter did the patient, invisible work of restoration. And the people on the land healed too, though the people took longer, as people always do, because people are more complicated than soil and carry their damage in places that rain and sunshine and the passage of time cannot easily reach. The farm economy found its footing again painfully and unevenly, the way a man with 2 broken legs learns to walk, for the second time one tentative step, followed by another, each one testing the strength of the repair before committing full weight. The survivors were the ones like Eli, the ones who owed nothing, the ones whose ambitions had been measured not in acres acquired or machinery purchased or net worth calculated on paper, but in debts avoided and independence maintained, and the quiet, unspectacular, profoundly unglamorous discipline of living within one's means. The community's perspective underwent a rotation so complete and so thorough that it would have been laughable if it had not been purchased with such an enormous quantity of human suffering. Eli Hargrove's stubbornness was now called wisdom. His old junk was now called reliable. His caution was now called foresight. His refusal to borrow was now called principle. The same men who had whispered about him at the co-op, calling him small-time and risk-averse, and stuck in the past, now drove up his lane on Saturday mornings with their hats in their hands and their questions ready. Could Eli help them time an injector pump? Could he show them how to rebuild a hydraulic cylinder? Could he explain how a man reads a balance sheet so the numbers tell the truth instead of the story you want to hear? Could he teach them how to weld up a set of worn cultivator sweeps so they would last another season because the money for new ones was not in the budget and would not be for some time? Eli helped everyone who asked. He did not charge for his time or his knowledge. He did not lecture or moralize or say, "I told you so," because that phrase, even when it is accurate, especially when it is accurate, serves no purpose except to diminish the speaker and wound the listener. He simply showed up with his toolbox and his expertise and his willingness to work, and he shared what he knew with the same generosity that Margaret had shown when she organized the food drives and drove Carol Prescott to her medical appointments. Knowledge, like kindness, increases when it is given away. His father had taught him that too in those evening conversations that had covered so much more than farming. Eli towed the Steiger home on a Saturday afternoon in late spring, pulling the massive machine behind his pickup truck on a heavy logging chain, driving slowly, the giant tractor rolling on its 8 flat-spotted, air-starved tires with the reluctant compliance of a captured animal being led from the field of battle. It was an odd sight, a 15,000-pound articulated 4-wheel drive being towed by a half-ton Chevrolet pickup that was older than most of the hired hands in the county, and the neighbors who saw it from their fields stopped their tractors and watched it pass with expressions that ranged from amusement to something approaching awe. Eli Hargrove, the man who had spent a decade being told he was too small and too cautious and too old-fashioned to matter, was towing home the most conspicuous symbol of the era that had just destroyed the men who said it. He parked the Steiger in his machine shed next to the 4020 and the 4430 and the old Farmall H, a lineup of tractors that spanned 4 decades of American agricultural history and represented 4 different philosophies of power and purpose and the relationship between a man and his machine. And then he spent the winter tinkering with it the way he had spent every winter of his adult life tinkering with something because idle hands were not part of the Hargrove vocabulary, and winter evenings were for working on machinery the way summer days were for working in the field. He started with the engine because the engine is always the heart, regardless of what kind of machine it lives in. The Detroit diesel was a 2-stroke design fundamentally different from the 4-stroke John Deeres he had grown up with, and it took him several evenings of reading the service manual before he felt confident enough to begin turning wrenches. The principles, however, were the same. Air in fuel and compression combustion, exhaust out. The chemistry and the physics do not care what color the paint is or what name is cast into the valve cover. He changed the oil in both fuel filters, tested the compression on each cylinder with a gauge he borrowed from a retired mechanic in town, adjusted the injector timing using a dial indicator and the specifications printed in the manual that he had ordered from a Steiger dealer in Minnesota, who was surprised and slightly confused to receive a request for technical literature from a farmer in Iowa who had bought the tractor for $5,000 at a foreclosure auction. On a cold November evening, with the propane shop heater glowing red in the corner and a cup of Margaret's coffee cooling on the workbench beside him, Eli turned the key on the Steiger for the first time. The starter motor engaged with a sound like a small earthquake, the massive flywheel spinning up with a momentum that made the entire machine shudder on its flat tires, and then the Detroit diesel caught and erupted to life with a roar that shook the rafters of the machine and vibrated the tools off the pegboard and sent every barn cat in the county sprinting for cover. The sound was enormous, industrial, overwhelming the voice of a machine that had been designed to move mountains and that did not know how to speak softly. Eli let it run for 20 minutes, watching the temperature gauge climb, listening to the rhythm with an ear trained by decades of diesel engines to detect the slightest irregularity. It ran clean and strong. The heart of the beast was healthy. Then he turned his attention to the transmission, the component that had failed and set in motion the chain of events that had contributed to the destruction of a man's life. He split the tractor at the articulation point using a floor jack and timber cribbing in the slow incremental patient approach of a man who understands that a machine this size can kill you in an instant if you take a shortcut or make an assumption or let your attention wander for even a moment. The two halves of the tractor separated like a mechanical cell, dividing the front unit rolling forward on its 4 tires, while the rear unit sat on blocks, its transmission housing exposed. He unbolted the housing and lowered it to the clean concrete floor with a jack, and then he opened it up the way a surgeon opens a chest, removing the cover plates and the access panels and exposing the gear train to the harsh revealing light of the drop lamp. He found it immediately. The root cause of the $10,000 catastrophe that had been one of the final blows in the collapse of Wade Prescott's empire. A single bearing. A tapered roller bearing seated in a machine cup on the main output shaft, a component so small you could hold it in the palm of one hand, a part that cost perhaps $12 or $15 at any industrial supply counter in the country, and could be replaced in an afternoon by any mechanic with a bearing puller and a hydraulic press and a basic understanding of how rotating assemblies work. The bearing had failed. The rollers had seized in their race, probably from contamination, a speck of grit, or a sliver of metal that had found its way past the seals and lodged between the hardened steel surfaces. When it seized, it scored the shaft and generated particles of steel that were picked up by the transmission oil and carried throughout the gearbox like poison in a bloodstream, depositing themselves on the precision machine surfaces of the planetary gear, so where they acted as an abrasive compound, wearing away the case-hardened tooth profiles until the gears could no longer maintain their mesh, and the transmission stripped and locked, and the most expensive, most powerful tractor in the county became a $200,000 decoration, sitting in a farmyard with its paint fading in the sun. Eli held the failed bearing in his hand for a long time, turning it under the light examining the score marks and the heat discoloration on the inner race that told the story of its final hours of operation. So much destruction from such a small component, such an enormous amount of human suffering, traced back to a part that weighed less than a pound and cost less than a good dinner at the restaurant in town. It was, he thought, a metaphor so perfect it hardly needed to be stated. The biggest machine in the county brought down by one of its smallest parts. The largest operation in the county brought down by the smallest shift in the variables that sustained it. Everything connected. Everything dependent on everything else. And when one small thing fails, the whole structure comes apart, not because the structure was weak, but because nobody was paying attention to the small things. He ordered replacement gears from a salvage dealer in North Dakota who specialized in Steiger components, a man whose inventory occupied 2 acres of warehouse space and whose knowledge of the Steiger product line was encyclopedic. The bearings he sourced from an industrial supply house in Minneapolis, specifying the exact part number and the exact tolerance and the exact grade of steel, because after what he had seen, he was not going to rebuild this transmission with anything less than the best components available. He did the work himself in his own shop during the long winter evenings when the fields were buried in snow and the wind sang under the eaves and the radio played country music low enough to provide company without interfering with thought. He pressed the new bearings into their cups with his hydraulic press, watching the dial indicator to ensure they seated fully and squarely. He shimmied the gear sets to the specifications in the manual, adjusting the backlash and the end play with the precision that the factory had intended and that the previous mechanics had evidently not achieved. He reassembled the transmission, housing torqued every bolt to specification, filled it with fresh oil of the correct viscosity in the correct additive package, and then he reconnected the 2 halves of the tractor and lowered the rear end off the blocks and stood back and looked at the machine he had brought back from the dead. The total investment was $10,000 in parts, twice what he had paid for the entire tractor at auction, plus several hundred hours of his own labor, which he did not calculate or record because a man does not send himself an invoice for his own education, and the winter he spent inside that transmission housing was an education as thorough and as valuable as any he had ever received. The following spring, when the ground thawed and the dealers began advertising and the annual cycle of buying and selling resumed its familiar rhythm, Eli sold the rebuilt Steiger to a large corporate farming operation in the river bottoms of southern Iowa. It was an outfit with 6,000 acres of flat, fertile, alluvial soil, the kind of ground that could justify and sustain the appetite of a machine that size. They sent a flatbed to pick it up, and Eli watched the Steiger roll onto the trailer for the last time, its lime green paint still faded, but its engine running strong and its transmission as tight as the day it left the factory in Fargo, and he felt something that was not quite relief and not quite nostalgia, but contained elements of both. He had made a handsome profit on the transaction. But the profit, as always with Eli, was not the point. The point was closing a chapter, putting the symbol of a painful era to rest in a place where it could do useful work instead of sitting in the sun as a monument to failure. Wade Prescott became Eli's tenant on the home place. It was an arrangement that began with the formality of a business transaction, the crop share agreement written out on a single sheet of paper at the kitchen table with Margaret, as witnessed the terms fair to both parties, the expectations clearly stated. But over the course of the seasons that followed, over the shared mornings of spring planting and the long afternoons of summer cultivation and the exhausting, exhilarating weeks of fall harvest, when both men worked from before dawn until after dark, and the combines ran by headlight, and the grain wagons lined up at the elevator like ships waiting for a berth, the relationship changed. The formality softened. The boundaries blurred. The landlord and the tenant became neighbors. And the neighbors gradually, tentatively, with the cautious progress of 2 men who have spent a decade on opposite sides of a philosophical divide, became friends. The arrogance that had defined Wade Prescott for as long as anyone could remember was gone. Not suppressed or hidden or banked like a fire waiting for fresh fuel. Genuinely gone. Burned away by the crisis the way impurities are burned from raw metal in a forge, consumed by a heat so intense that nothing false or borrowed or performative could survive it, leaving behind only the essential material, the core, the truth of the man that had been buried under years of bluster and borrowed confidence. What remained was quieter and smaller and immeasurably more authentic than what had been removed. Wade farmed his father's 160 acres with a care and an attention and a gratitude that expressed itself not in speeches or declarations, but in the daily evidence of work done well. His fence rows were clean, his waterways were grassed and maintained. His terraces, the conservation structures he had once bulldozed flat on his own land because they interfered with the turning radius of the Steiger, were preserved and repaired. He maintained his equipment himself, learning skills he had once paid others to perform and dismissed as beneath the dignity of a man who could afford to write a check, and discovering in the process a satisfaction so deep and so genuine that it surprised him. The satisfaction of understanding how things work, of being able to diagnose a problem and solve it with your own hands and your own knowledge, of knowing that when something breaks, you are not helpless, not dependent, not waiting by the telephone for someone else to come and save you. He never borrowed another dollar, not from a bank, not from a credit union, not from a friend, not from anyone. He farmed with what he had, and what he had, it turned out, was not just enough, but abundant in ways that had nothing to do with quantity and everything to do with the quality of a life lived in honest proportion to its means. He found, to his own profound and genuine surprise, a peace that all the borrowed horsepower and all the inflated acreage and all the gleaming new machinery and all the booming confident laughter had never come within 100 miles of providing. It was the peace of a man who has stopped running and discovered that the place where he stands is exactly where he needs to be. One cool autumn evening years later, when the combines had been cleaned and parked, and the fields lay bare and brown under a sky that was turning from blue to gold to the deep saturated amber of late October, Eli and his son Nathan were in the shop. Nathan was a young man now 20 years old, tall and broad-shouldered, with his father's quiet manner and his mother's sharp, observant eyes, and a set of hands that were already developing the calluses and the grease-stained creases that marked a man who worked with machinery and worked with it well. He had grown up in this shop, absorbing knowledge through his pores, the way a tree absorbs water through its roots, silently, continuously, without conscious effort, simply by being present in the place where knowledge lived and being attentive to the lessons that it offered. He had watched the repossession trucks roll down neighboring lanes when he was a child. He had seen the dark houses and the empty yards and the for sale signs that went up and stayed up for months because nobody was buying. He had heard the stories told in the low, careful voices that adults use when they are discussing things they do not want children to fully understand, but cannot completely hide. He had absorbed the lessons not through lectures or textbooks or formal instruction, but through the lived experience of watching his father navigate a world that was destroying better funded and more ambitious men on every side, and surviving not through luck or timing, but through the methodical, relentless, unglamorous application of principles that had been old when his great-grandfather was young. They were working on the 4020 that evening. The tractor had been fully retired from fieldwork for years, replaced in its duties by the 443. Oh, but Eli kept it in perfect running condition, because some things in this life you maintain not because they are useful, but because they are true. Because they represent something that transcends their function. Because to let them deteriorate would be to let a piece of yourself deteriorate along with them. The engine was tuned and ran as smoothly as it had the day Eli installed the salvage pump from Becker's yard. The paint was faded but clean. The grease fittings were serviced on schedule. The tires held air. The battery was charged. It sat in its place in the shop like a retired general in a comfortable chair, its service record impeccable, its bearing dignified, its readiness undiminished. Nathan was wiping grease from his hands with a red shop rag, the same motion his father had performed 10,000 times before him, the same twist of the cloth, the same attention to the spaces between the fingers where the grease hides. "Dad," he said, "I have been reading about the new equipment, online. The GPS auto-steering systems that use satellite positioning to guide the tractor down the row within an inch of accuracy. The yield monitors that map the harvest in real time, showing you exactly how many bushels each part of each field produced so you can adjust your inputs the following year. The variable rate planting technology that changes the seed population on the fly based on soil type within the same field. It is incredible what they can do now. A man hardly has to steer anymore. The technology does it for him, down to the inch." Eli nodded. He was tightening a bolt on the alternator bracket, his wrench moving with the unconscious precision of long practice. the kind of muscle memory that takes years to develop and becomes once developed as reliable as gravity. It is impressive, he said, no question about it. The engineering is remarkable. Do you ever wish you had gone for it, Nathan asked. The question was not casual. It had the weight of something that had been forming in his mind for some time, gaining mass and definition until it demanded to be spoken aloud. After the bust, you could have bought land for a quarter of its value, expanded for pennies on the dollar. Every financial advisor in the state would have told you it was the opportunity of a lifetime. Eli stopped working. He set the wrench down on the workbench, carefully placing it in the exact spot where it belonged, and he turned to face his son. He looked at Nathan for a moment with an expression that held something deeper than the usual paternal affection, something that was closer to the look a man gives a younger version of himself when he recognizes the moment he has been waiting for, the moment when the conversation that matters most is finally ready to happen. Then he did something he rarely did. He gestured, slowly, deliberately. He swept his arm in a wide arc that took in the entire interior of the shop. The tools hanging on the pegboard wall, each one outlined with a black marker so that its absence would be noticed immediately and its return could be accomplished without searching. The workbench his father had built from railroad ties, its surface worn smooth by decades of projects and repairs, and Saturday afternoons spent teaching a boy how to use a torque wrench and read a micrometer and listen to a diesel engine with the same attentiveness you would give to a piece of muscle. The tractors sitting in their places in the warm glow of the overhead lights, the 443, and the 4020 and the venerable Farmall H3 machines from three different eras, each one maintained. Each one paid for, each one a chapter in a story that had been written in iron and sweat and the stubborn refusal to owe. Then he extended his arm and pointed out through the big open door of the shop, past the gravel yard, past the house where Margaret was visible through the kitchen window, moving between the stove and the table in the warm yellow light of the lamp she had owned since the early years of their marriage, past the barn with its steel siding and the strong straight roof he had put on with his own hands, and out over the fields that stretched in every direction to the distant tree line. Fields that were bathed in the kind of light that only exists for perhaps 20 minutes on an autumn evening in Iowa when the sun is low on the horizon and the air is clean and still, and the whole world looks as if it has been dipped in liquid gold. Fields that bore the Hargrove name on the deed and no other name on any document filed in any courthouse in the state. All of that technology, Eli said quietly, nodding in the general direction of the future that Nathan was describing with such admiration. The screens and the satellites and the software and the algorithms. It is extraordinary. I do not deny that for a second, but it is also, at the end of the day, just steel and silicon and circuits. It is temporary. The tractor you buy today with all that technology will be outdated in 5 years and genuinely obsolete in 10. The software will need updating, and the updates will cost money, and eventually they will stop supporting your model entirely, and you will have to buy a new one or do without. The screens will crack, and the wiring will corrode, and the circuit boards will fail in ways that no amount of mechanical skill can diagnose or repair without a proprietary computer that the dealer charges $200 an hour to plug in. It is all temporary, every bit of it. He paused. The evening light was deepening, the gold giving way to amber, the amber beginning to darken toward the reds and purples that would precede the stars. What matters, he said, what has always mattered, always. What will still matter when the last satellite falls out of orbit and the last computer screen goes dark and the last software subscription expires. Is this, he tapped his temple with a finger that had a crescent of dark grease embedded in the nail bed, the knowledge to fix what breaks, the understanding of how things work. Not just how to operate them, how to push the buttons and follow the prompts on the screen, but how they actually function. Down to the bearings in the seals and the tolerances, down to the physics. You cannot download that knowledge. You cannot finance it. You cannot lease it from a dealer for a monthly payment. You earn it one repair at a time with your own hands and your own patience and your own willingness to lie on your back on a cold concrete floor and fight with a seized bolt until it gives, or you do. And once you have that knowledge, once it lives in your hands and your head, nobody can take it from you. No bank can foreclose on it. No market can devalue it. No recession can repossess it. Then he moved his hand from his temple to his chest, pressing his palm flat against his sternum, against the heart that had been beating steadily in that chest for more than 50 years. A heart that had known fear and doubt and the midnight terror of a broken injector pump in the middle of planting season, but that had never known the particular dread of a certified letter from a banker. And this, he said, the discipline to know the difference between what you want and what you need. The patience to sit still during the bad years instead of borrowing your way through them and making the next bad year twice as hard. The courage to be small when everyone around you is getting big. The wisdom to understand that the man who owes nothing fears nothing, and the man who fears nothing is free. And freedom real, freedom the kind you can feel in your bones when you wake up in the morning and look out the window at land that is yours. That is the only wealth that does not depreciate. He looked at Nathan with an intensity that the young man would carry with him for the rest of his life, would recall on difficult nights when the temptations were real and the world was offering easy terms and fast growth, and the seductive whispered promise that this time it really was different and the old rules did not apply. Your grandfather told me something when I was about your age, Eli said. We were standing right here in this shop, right here on this spot, and he put his hand on my shoulder the way I am putting mine on yours right now, and he said it once, just once, because he was the kind of man who believed that some truths only need to be spoken a single time if the person hearing them is ready to listen and willing to carry what they hear. He said the bank gives you an umbrella when the sun is shining and demands it back the second it starts to rain. Eli let the words settle into the warm, oil-scented, tool-hung air of the shop where 3 generations of Hargrove men had worked and learned and passed their knowledge forward. I have lived more than half a century now, he said, and I have never heard a truer sentence spoken in the English language. I have seen it proven, not once but many times, not to strangers in distant places, but to men I knew, men I liked, men. I respected men whose children played with my child. I watched it happen to Dawson and to Tommy Langford and to Wade Prescott and to dozens of others whose names you would not recognize because they were gone before you were old enough to remember them. We survived the flood, son, your mother and I, this farm, this family, not because we had the biggest boat or the fastest engine or the loudest horn to blow when the water was rising. We survived because we owned our own raincoat, bought and paid for with our own money that we earned with our own hands and saved with our own discipline and kept in our own jar on our own shelf in our own closet. And nobody, not a banker, not a market, not a politician making decisions in an office 1,000 miles from the nearest cornfield, not a drought, not an embargo, not a 21% interest rate, nobody could take it from us because it was ours. Truly ours, completely ours. The kind of ours that does not have an asterisk next to it, or a clause underneath it, or a payment due on the first of the month. Nathan looked at his father. He looked at the shop, at the tools in their outlined places on the wall, at the workbench that his grandfather had built from railroad ties before Nathan was born, at the tractors resting in the warm light like old companions who had earned the right to sit down. He looked out through the open door at the fields, turning gold in the last light of the day, at the land that carried his family's name on a deed that was free and clear and unencumbered by any obligation to any institution on the face of the earth, at the house where his mother was visible through the kitchen window, setting 3 places at a table that had held his family together through good years and bad, through boom and bust, through drought and abundance, through everything that the world and the weather and the economy had seen fit to deliver. And in his eyes, Eli saw that the lesson had arrived. Not just the words which were simple enough for a child to understand and profound enough for a wise man to spend a lifetime contemplating, but the meaning beneath the words, the philosophy that connected them to the soil under their boots and the history behind them and the future ahead of them. The understanding that had been passed down through 3 generations of Hargrove men, not through universities or financial advisors or best-selling books about wealth creation, but through the daily accumulating, year after year example of choosing the harder road and walking it all the way to the end and discovering at the end that it was not just the harder road, but the only road that led somewhere worth arriving at. The true legacy was never the acreage. It was never the horsepower or the bushels per acre or the number of digits in a bank account. It was never the size of the machine shed or the model year of the tractor or the number of zeros on the operating loan. The legacy was freedom, the freedom from fear, The freedom from the 3 in the morning anxiety of a man who knows he cannot make his payments. The freedom from a banker's telephone call at 6 a.m. The freedom from a certified letter in the mailbox with a return address that makes your stomach drop before you even open the envelope. The freedom to stand on your own land, in your own boots, with your own calloused, grease-stained hands, in your own worn pockets, and look at the sky in any direction, without flinching, without calculating, without wondering what it will cost you or who will come calling if the rain does not fall or the price does not hold. Knowing with absolute and unshakable certainty that whatever tomorrow brought drought or deluge feast or famine, rising costs or falling markets or any of the thousand uncertainties that farming delivers to your doorstep with the same regularity as the seasons themselves, you would meet it standing on your own terms, on your own ground, beholden to no one, answerable only to the land that sustained you and the weather that tested you and the God who made them both and who in his own time and his own way had always provided enough for a man who asked for no more than he needed and was grateful deeply and genuinely grateful for every single thing he received. And that Eli Hargrove knew with a certainty that went deeper than bone and deeper than blood, all the way down through the layers of clay and limestone and bedrock, to the very foundation of the earth that his grandfather had broken with a horse-drawn plow 100 years ago, was a harvest richer than any field, no matter how fertile, no matter how vast, no matter how perfectly planted and perfectly tended and perfectly blessed by sun and rain could ever produce.